This story took place when I was 8 years old, and my mother and I had just moved into a new house. I loved that house until I realized there was something strange. That something was our neighbor. We'll call him Steve. Steve was an older man, probably in his early 60s at the time. He was very socially awkward, so his wife had to do the talking for him when they were around. It wasn't until months later, when my mum and I were returning home from dinner at around 8:30 p.m, that I noticed Steve had ran to his window to watch us. He saw the headlights of my mum's car pull up to our house. He swung open his front door and pretended to take out the trash, although trash night had already passed. He just stood there watching my mum and I as we ran to the front door, and my mum was frantically trying to open it. We turned around to look and see where he was, and he just gave us the creepiest smile and wave I've ever seen. Later that night, around midnight, I heard a strange sound outside of my bedroom window. I kept on hearing it and I just couldn't figure out what it was. And then suddenly I realized that the sound was rocks hitting my window. I decided to go have a look outside my window and see what was going on. And outside my window was Steve. He was throwing the rocks. The next night, my mum and I went to the mall. It was roughly around 8 p.m. I felt as though we were being followed, so I whipped my head around and there he was. Steve was following us. He noticed us noticing him, so he decided to ditch his trolley, and then he quickly ran and hid behind a rack of clothes. Not long after this, my mum and I drove home, and once again there was Steve not far behind us. Luckily, that was all that happened that night. I couldn't call the police as there was no solid evidence, so one day I had had enough. I was in a room by a big sliding glass door, and Steve had come around my backyard and was just standing there and staring at me. I got really angry, yelled at him, and I locked my door and shut the curtains. When I peeked out the curtain, he was right up against the glass and he was just smiling at me. I felt like I couldn't live comfortably in my own home, so shortly after this we decided to move, and luckily we are now safe. I pray I never run into Steve again. This story took place back in the 90s when I was 8 years old. My uncle was visiting for the weekend from interstate, and he was sleeping in the room that me and my sister normally share, so we slept on the lounge. I finished playing my game, switched off the light, and I headed to bed. Thankfully, the couch I was sleeping on was comfortable, and I managed to fall asleep. Suddenly, I was awoken by a very distinctive sound. The door connected to our backyard pergola had been opened. My dad must not have locked it. I couldn't hear much after this sound. My dog was out there, and I'm pretty sure I heard his collar jingle a little bit. Suddenly, I felt wide awake, full of adrenaline. My heart was pounding. It was dead quiet. I was intently listening for any suspicious noises, but still, silence. I contemplated peeking behind the curtain, but I was way too scared of what I might have seen behind there. Instead, I stayed still, absolutely petrified. About 10 minutes went by when suddenly I heard that noise again, It was the door, except this time the door was slamming shut. I waited a couple of minutes, and then I asked my sister if she had heard the noises too. She responded yes, she had heard everything too, but she was much too scared to even open her eyes. We ran to my uncle's room, ready to tell him everything that had happened. I could tell he was quite tired, and I don't think he believed there was actually anything suspicious going on. Nonetheless, he got up, and I think for our peace of mind, he opened the curtains and turned the light on. Nothing there. My sister and I returned to the couch. Maybe we were just hearing things. I struggled to fall back asleep, but eventually I did. The next day, something happened that confirmed there was definitely an intruder in our backyard the night before. My dad went out to get the morning paper, and as soon as he went out there was the dog. He ran up to him, and thankfully he was unharmed and appeared happy. He must have followed the intruder out the backyard when he left. Unfortunately, we never found out who this intruder was, and we don't know what they were doing in our backyard and why. I am still a high school student, and this happened a few weeks ago. Since the coronavirus pandemic began to break out in the USA, everything has been shut down, including my two older brothers' college. They live in the city of Chicago in an apartment, but have no choice but to come home during this time since everything is online. Since they are not using the apartment, my family decided it would be best if we just had them move out of it, as that is what other people are doing, and there's really no point in paying rent on a place where you don't live. My father was originally supposed to drive to the city to pick up my older brothers, but he got caught up with some work-related stuff, so I was sent. I drove to the city, but it was night time, so the streets were dead empty. As soon as I got there, my brothers and I began loading the car so we could get home quickly. Whilst we were doing that, I noticed I could hear a sound from the nearby alley. I shrugged it off as nothing and thought maybe I was just tired and should have asked one of my brothers to drive us home. But soon after, I heard the same sound, and this time my brothers were with me and they also heard the noise. We all looked closer into the alley and we noticed a man emerge from the bushes. We asked if he was alright, but then suddenly we noticed that this man was wearing a mask over his face. Immediately I was concerned, as this masked man did not say a word and would just stare at us. We just completely froze as the man just continued to stare at us. He continued to stare, but then he moved to the side, and we noticed that behind him were 3 other men dressed similarly with masks on. But it wasn't the other 3 men that terrified us, it's what they had beside them. There was a body just lying flat on the ground, and I also noticed that one of the men were putting a knife away. We all freaked out and jumped into the car, and right then one of the men charged at us, but I stepped on the gas pedal by this time, just wanting to get out of there with my brothers. We looked back and the men were in the street just staring at us. Luckily, we had left nothing behind. We didn't say anything for about 10 minutes, but then we eventually called the cops. They said they'd look into it, but unfortunately, they found nothing. I still wonder to this day what would have happened if we didn't get into the car as fast as we did, and if one of those men had caught up to us. I don't know why they murdered another man like that, and I honestly do not want to know. All I can say is, stay home and stay safe. This happened back in 2018. I went to the doctors because my newborn had flu-like symptoms From time to time, she seemed to be struggling to breathe. The doctor said it would be best I took my girl to the emergency department. I was sitting in the waiting room, waiting to be seen by pediatrics. I'd been waiting a long time. I'd been here before and I knew how things worked. If you were a patient or were visiting and you needed to get to the patient's ward, you needed to be buzzed in and then the door would be open. There was no other way in there. I quickly had to step out of the hospital because I forgot to bring the nappies in with me and I needed to change my daughter. When I came back, I noticed a woman was waiting to be seen by the receptionist. At first, I did not pay much attention to her, as there was also a man who was trying to get buzzed into the ward, and it was quite clear that this man was a drug addict. He was known to the staff and would come in when he needed help, when he was suffering withdrawal symptoms or something similar like that. He got let through and the door shut, and as it shut, the woman walked up to the door and she tried to open it, which obviously she was unable to. One thing I noticed as well was that she was also constantly going in and out of the bathroom. Over time, a doctor would come out and call a patient to be seen. The door would open and she would try to get into the ward, but each time she failed to do so. This woman didn't talk. She wouldn't communicate with anyone why she wanted to get in the ward so badly. Security were nearby as well, monitoring the situation. She went into the bathroom again, and I could tell that the staff were getting quite suspicious of her. A bit of time passed when suddenly we heard this big bang coming from the bathroom. Security went and knocked on the door to ask if she was okay. This was the first time she spoke, but she only said yes. A few minutes later, we heard the bang again, and this time the security guard, who was a male, was given approval to inspect the woman's bathroom. He opened the door, and to his surprise, the bathroom was empty. Nobody was in there. Everyone was very confused. Where did she go? A bit of time passed, and suddenly I heard this huge crash. There was dust everywhere, and I heard something crash right next to where I was sitting. I quickly got out of harm's way and checked on my newborn. Luckily, she and myself were left unharmed. I looked up to see what was going on, and I just saw a hole in the roof and a lady's legs dangling out of that hole. It had to be the lady from the bathroom. She managed to get back into the roof and she crawled away. She kept on crawling and made it into the ward. She was causing a lot of damage. I'm not sure how, but eventually she got down and the police apprehended her. When they took her out of the building, I noticed she was wrapped in towels, but she was quite obviously naked. She must have stripped down while she was crawling up there. After this happened, I finally got seen by pediatrics. Luckily, my newborn was okay and we got sent home. I never found out what happened to the lady, but I sincerely hope she got the help she needed. I've always been good friends with one of my cousins, who we'll call Cole, who's the same age as I am. The two of us were not quite inseparable, but we always did get along very well together and were often found together, both in school, as we'd always wound up in the same class together. When we were 12 and in the 6th grade, I was hanging out with Cole on a Friday afternoon, and at one point my mum called to say that our grandpa was in the hospital. While the issue with our grandpa wasn't expected to be life-threatening, he was being kept at the hospital overnight for observation. I was told that I was given the okay to stay at Cole's house for the night, with Cole's 15-year-old brother, who we'll call Hunter, being in charge while our parents were out. We ordered out for pizza and enjoyed goofing off as boys that age tend to do. At around 9 p.m. or so, there was a knock at the front door and Cole went to answer it. I was a bit curious as to who it could be at that time of the night, and so I watched from a ways back. At the door were two older guys. They said that they were with the city and that they were investigating reports about the water pressure supposedly being bad in the neighborhood. They asked Cole if his parents were home, and when Cole said they were unavailable at that moment, which we were told to say to strangers if our parents weren't home, the guys started asking a bunch of questions about how the water pressure was in the house and if they could come inside to check. Hunter came over at that point and politely told the guys that the water pressure was fine and perhaps they should move on to check on other homes in the neighborhood. The guys seemed reluctant to leave, but turned away and walked after Hunter started closing the door. After the door was shut, we looked at each other and shrugged, but didn't think too much of it after that and went back to goofing off. Eventually, we decided to go to bed. Cole and Hunter shared a bedroom, and we all agreed that I'd sleep in there with them, and Hunter grabbed a sleeping bag out of their camping supplies for me. When we got in the bedroom, they stripped down to their briefs. Since I hadn't originally planned on staying the night, I hadn't brought anything with me from home as far as overnight stuff, but since I wasn't in the mood to sleep in my clothes, I also stripped down to my briefs. Early the next morning, I got up because I had to pee. On the way back to the bedroom, I heard something in the family room, which was on the opposite end of the house. I didn't pay too much attention to it at the time, thinking it must be either Cole or Hunter, until I got back into the bedroom and I realized that both of them were still asleep in their beds. Trying not to panic, I woke them and told them that I thought someone was in the house. They quietly followed me, and the moment we walked into the family room, we saw the two guys from the night before in there, and it was rather clear that they were robbing the place. One of them started moving towards us as he pulled out a wicked-looking knife. The three of us promptly raced to the front door, and we fled outside. As luck would have it, a cop was driving by at that particular moment, and within a couple of minutes, several other cops were there as well, and they proceeded to enter the house, and after some searching, they caught the two guys. To add insult to injury, while we were standing outside while the cops searched the house, both to get the two guys and make sure there was no one else with them, some of the neighbors came out to see what the commotion was about, and this included some kids who went to the same school as Cole and myself, including a few who were in the 6th grade class with us. It was during that time that the three of us realized that we'd never had the chance to get dressed, so, just like in the stereotypical nightmare, we had to stand outside in full view of everyone in just our briefs for what seemed like forever, before being allowed back inside. When we went back to school on Monday, Cole and I had to put up with more than a bit of snickering, stares, and ribbing for the next few weeks until school ended for the summer. I don't know what sentence the guys got, but I hope I never run into them ever again. This story began one night about 10 years ago when me and my friend were 5 minutes from the center of the city and we were heading to a gig. He was a musician and had a lot of friends who were also in a band. It's because of this that when we were walking past this abandoned warehouse, it caught his eye. He noticed there was a broken window on the side of the building. He made the impulsive decision to climb up the building and then enter through the broken window. He said it was very dark and he could not see much, so he decided to put on his phone light, and from what he could see, he knew it was perfect. He wanted to use this warehouse so he and his friends' bands can play gigs there, sort of like an underground concert. And so it went ahead. Many bands agreed to play at the abandoned venue. They managed to get a generator to ensure there was power and that they could play, and it was really surreal in there. Word must have got out because there was a large amount of people at these gigs, and it was a pretty crazy time. On one of the nights, me and my friend decided to go exploring the warehouse to see what else was there. We went walking through a pretty dark area when we noticed something. It was a tent set up in the middle of the warehouse, really odd. We decided to inspect the tent and see if someone or something was in there. When we shined the light on the tent, there was nothing but rubbish and beer cans, but there also was a diary. I decided to pick up the diary and have a little bit of a read. What was in the diary would end up shocking me to my very core. In the diary was explicit details of a homeless man and his infatuation with a woman whom was virtually a stranger to him. He explained how he had fantasies of stalking and killing her, and it was just full of nonsensical ramblings from an obviously crazed homeless man. I freaked out, and just when I didn't think I could get any more spooked, I started to hear some rustling. Was he coming back to his tent? I froze. My friend shined the torch on where the noise was coming from. Even though it was just a rat, we took it as a sign to leave, and we briskly walked out of there. We decided to leave the warehouse entirely after this, and we never, ever went back. I think there was only 1 or maybe 2 more nights at the warehouse, and either it died down or the cops found out about it. My friend ended up keeping the diary, but I'm not sure what he did with it. Either way, I'm glad we never ran into the crazed homeless man. My name is Sarah. I'm an 18-year-old girl, and this happened to me last summer in the middle of August. I was walking home after going to one of my friend's house to hang out and do typical things a normal girl would do for a few hours. I knew I could have just driven home, but it was only a 15-minute walk, so I decided to do the latter so I could enjoy the fresh summer air. It was around 9:30 p.m, and by this time, everyone in the neighborhood had settled in their homes for the night, leaving the street devoid of any activity. Whilst walking, I had that cliche feeling that I was being watched. I constantly looked around me to see if I was being followed, but luckily, no sign of life. I was just 3 minutes walking distance from my house when I reached an intersection. I pushed the button and waited for the light to turn green, and then I proceeded to cross the road. That's when I saw him for the first time. A fully grown man who clearly looked to be somewhere in his 40s. He came out from behind a light pole without any warning and scared the living daylights out of me. He was wearing a hoodie and baggy pants, even though it was something like 80 degrees Fahrenheit outside. "Hi there, young lady," said the man. "That's a really nice outfit you got there," in his raspy voice. His breath reeked of cigarettes. He then went on to say how attractive I was, further making me feel uncomfortable. This sort of attention from men was nothing new to me, but this man was clearly 30 years older than me at least. He offered to escort me home, but I declined. Following this, he asked if I had a boyfriend, and I lied to him and said yes. I can tell he was starting to lose his cool just by his voice. Most likely, as a desperate last-ditch effort to win me over, he cut right to the chase and straight up asked me if I wanted to go out on a date with him, and then he flashed a really hideous grin. Just about had enough of this guy. I clenched my fist, told him in his face that I'm not interested, and turned to leave, but he grabbed me by the shoulders and tried to drag me away to only God knows where. During the struggle, I saw a white van with the windows tinted and the license plate suspiciously covered in duct tape. I thought those were the final moments of my life right then and there. I tried so hard not to cry as I practically was on the verge of tears. I managed to work up the courage to fight back and kicked him as hard as I could on his shin. Believe it or not, it worked. He yelled in pain, cursing, stumbled backwards to the ground whilst clutching his shin, and thankfully he let go of me. I booked it out of there, took a slight detour route to my house just in case he decided to follow me. I dared not to look behind me the whole way back. When I got home, I didn't call the cops for some reason, nor did I tell anyone else about it. Not even my own family, probably because I was still traumatized at what had just happened. It all happened so quickly. Nowadays, I regret not telling anyone about the incident because now there's still a crazy psycho out there looking for its next victim, or even worse, trying to look for me again. From then on, whenever I walked somewhere, I always made sure I had someone with me. Never did I walk alone again, especially at night. This story happened to me when I was younger and began at the movie theatre at our local shopping complex. Me and my friend were enjoying the film and having a good time when I happened to glance behind me and I noticed something. It was this guy. He was roughly the same age as us, and he was just looking at us with this intense stare. I quickly faced the movie again, and I just tried to ignore it. I was starting to feel uneasy, so I decided to look behind me again, and still, the guy's eyes were locked on us. I turned around again and just watched the remainder of the film. The movie finished, and we made our way out. The creepy guy was not far behind us, but there was only one way out, so it's not like he was stalking us. We made our way down the escalator, and once again I looked back to see if he was there, and there he was, only this time he was really close to us. I started to feel really anxious, and I did not know what to do. He continued to follow us, but suddenly he was just gone. I felt so much relief. I could relax again. We left the shopping centre and headed for the train home, and we were about to go up some stairs. I turned around and suddenly noticed that this guy was once again following us, only this time he was sprinting towards us. I yelled at my friend and we sprinted up the stairs. He, however, was quickly catching us. We made it up the stairs and were running through the car park, and we decided to hide behind one of the cars in the hope that he would not find us. We stayed quiet, although I felt like my breathing was making so much noise, like he would be able to hear it and find us. I was trying to hold my breath. Suddenly, we heard footsteps. They were getting close. He was going to find us. I was so terrified in that moment. Just a jogger. I breathed a sigh of relief. We waited a little while longer, but there was no longer any sign of him. We caught the train home, and we were feeling at ease. I didn't know what the man wanted, but I'm super glad that we didn't find out. I was still so paranoid he may have been on that train, but thankfully he wasn't. This happened back when my son was 9 months old. He was sleeping in his own room that my husband had just completed upgrading, and we decided it was a good idea to keep a baby monitor in there so we would hear him when he wakes up from his naps or during the night. The monitor did not have video, it was strictly sound. Nothing odd happened for quite a while, but over time I noticed something was different. My son would normally wake up during the night, and I would usually go into his room and comfort him, and then he would go back to sleep. This wasn't happening anymore. I would hear my son and give him a few minutes to try and settle, and it seemed that this process was working. I no longer needed to comfort him. This seemed to be the theme for the next week or so, but one night my son woke and was crying. I swear I could hear humming and shushing coming from his room, and then silence. My son was no longer crying. I rushed into his room and there was nothing suspicious. He was sleeping peacefully, nothing out of place. Everything was normal. One morning I was awake but resting, and my husband got up as he had to go to work. About 20 minutes later, I once again heard my son wake up. I heard him being attended to, and very quickly my son was making no noise. He must be peacefully sleeping again. Another 20 minutes later, I decided I would text my husband and thank him for sorting out our son before he went to work. His response is something that I'll never forget, and it will forever haunt me. He said, "I didn't sort him out this morning. He was still asleep when I left." My eyes widened. Adrenaline hit. What is happening in my son's room? I ran into his room and swung the door open. Thankfully, my son was in there, but he was no longer in his cot. He was on the floor. He has clearly had his nappy changed and is in a new outfit, plus was drinking from a freshly warm bottle. If my husband didn't do this, then who did? I quickly took the bottle from my son, picked him up, took him out of the house and called the police. The police arrived quickly and 2 officers went into the house to search. 10 minutes later they came out, but they weren't alone. With them, in handcuffs, was a woman, an old woman, could have been in her 60s. As the police took her into the back of the squad car, she was just staring at my son. Right before they put her in the car, she gave my son the scariest smile, which chilled me right to my core, something I will never forget. The police said that they had a look around the house and decided to look in my crawlspace. Quickly, it became evident that someone was living there. It didn't take them long to find the old lady, and thankfully, she went with them peacefully. Fortunately, my son was okay. I contacted my husband and he came straight home, except with him, he had a new baby monitor, but this one had the video function. I now find myself hooked to looking at this monitor, terrified there may be someone in the room with my son. This story happened a few years ago whilst I was driving across the Australian outback. I am a truck driver and I spend most of my time transporting steel from one place to another. I drive a triple road train. It's 53 meters long. It is the same length as an Olympic-sized swimming pool. One afternoon, roughly around 3 p.m, I was driving through the outback. A cyclone had been and gone and the rain was very heavy. Nothing but black clouds. Eventually, I reached one of the more challenging parts of my trip, a river crossing. This river has flowing water streaming across the path. When you come to the river crossing, you either commit to crossing them or you don't. With my truck, I should have enough horsepower to carry me through. I decided to commit. I powered over the river and it seemed to be going well. I managed to get the first 2 trailers over when suddenly the truck came to a complete halt. What I feared had happened. The 3rd trailer had gotten stuck in the soft sand, right in the middle of the river crossing. Why was I so concerned? I knew what I had to do to get out of the river, and I knew how to do it, but I knew there was something out there, lurking, that's going to make this task extremely dangerous. That thing is the saltwater crocodile. This situation is nothing new to the crocodile. This massive truck going over the river crossing has just created a lot of noise and could have attracted their attention. What I needed to do was hop out of the truck and gather some logs and wedge the logs under the legs of the 3rd trailer. I gathered the logs I needed and started making my way across the river crossing, trying to avoid splashing to ensure I don't attract their attention. I put the logs under the 3rd trailer successfully. So far, so good. I quietly made my way back to the truck and I thought I could hear something. Was something lurking in the water? It seemed like everything went quiet. Then it happened. I heard a huge splash and could feel this mammoth of a creature hurtling towards me. The adrenaline hit me instantly and I sprinted for safety. I'll always be thankful that I managed to avoid the predator's unforgiving jaws. I got back in my truck and I just prayed the logs I laid down would get me out of this mess. I started it up and attempted to move forward. Pushing on the accelerator, nothing seemed to be happening. I was daunted by the prospect of having to go back there and reorganize the logs. Then suddenly, success. The truck powered forward and in seconds I was out of the river and free to continue on my journey. Still full of adrenaline and disbelief, I powered on. In future, I have decided not to cross these crossings alone or without potential aid. The thought of a croc dragging me in the river will forever haunt me. My last semester at a certain college, I was assaulted by a football player for walking where he was trying to drive. Note that he weighed 325 pounds, I was only 120. Whilst unconscious on the ground, I lived a different life. I met a wonderful young lady. She made my heart skip and my face red. I pursued her for months and dispatched a few jerk boyfriends before I finally won her over. After 2 years, we got married, and almost immediately, we birthed our first daughter. I had a great job, and my wife didn't have to work outside of the house. When my daughter was 2, my wife and I birthed our second child, a beautiful baby boy. My son was the joy of my life. I would walk into his room every morning before I left for work and doted on him and my daughter. One day, while sitting on the couch, I noticed that the perspective of the lamp was odd, like inverted. It was still in 3D, but just wrong. It was a square lamp base, red with gold trim, on 4 legs and a white square shade. I was transfixed. I couldn't look away from it. I stayed up all night staring at it. The next morning I didn't go to work. Something was just not right about that lamp. I stopped eating. I left the couch only to use the bathroom at first. Soon I stopped that too, as I was not eating or drinking. I stared at the fucking lamp for 3 days before my wife got really worried. She had someone come and try to talk to me. By this time, my awareness of my surroundings was breaking up, and my wife was freaking out. She took the kids to her mother's house just before I had my epiphany. The lamp is not real. This house is not real. My wife, my kids, none of it is real. The last 10 years of my life are not fucking real. The lamp started to grow wider and deeper. It was still inverted dimensions. It took up my entire perspective, and all I could see was red. I heard voices, screams, all kinds of weird noises, and I became aware of pain. A fucking shit ton of pain. The first words I said were, "I'm missing teeth," and opened my eyes. I was laying on my back on the sidewalk, surrounded by people that I didn't know. Lots were freaking out, and I was just completely confused. At some point, a cop scooped me up, dragged me across the sidewalk and grass, and threw me face down into the back of a cop car. I was still confused. I was taken to the hospital by the cop. Seems he didn't want to wait for the ambulance to arrive and give CT scans and other checks. I went through about 3 years of horrid depression. I was grieving the loss of my wife and children and dealing with the knowledge that they never existed. I was scared that I was going insane, as I would cry myself to sleep, hoping I would see her in my dreams. I never have, but sometimes I see my son, usually just a glimpse out of my peripheral vision. He is perpetually 5 years old, and I can never hear what he says. One night, I was on the side of the road whilst I was on patrol. I was just taking a brief break and enjoying my coffee when I started hearing something. It sounded like there was a vehicle approaching where I was. Then suddenly, this truck just zoomed past me and it was driving erratically. So immediately, I pursued the driver. I thought it was odd and suspicious that someone would be on this road this late whilst the weather was this wild, especially a trucker. I signaled for the driver to pull over, and he eventually did. We were pulled over on the side of the highway. I got out of my car and I began to approach the driver. I shined the light on his face, and this was when he revealed that his face was covered in blood. When I asked him about the blood, I was not expecting his response. He began explaining how he had brutally clubbed a deer to death with a weapon. I was shocked, so I inspected the back of his truck. It was completely empty, apart from a bloody wrench and scissors. I questioned him further, but his story was constantly changing and his behavior was very suspicious. I ended up arresting him under the Wildlife Act and began investigating his claim of illegally killing an animal. I got in contact with a conservation officer who was skilled in tracking, and I got him to assist me in finding the deer that the man claimed to have killed. He managed to find tire tracks on a road just off the highway that matched the truck. He followed the tracks up the road, and then in the freshly fallen snow, he managed to find footprints leading into the woods. He tracked the footprints, staying alert and looking for the deer. The footprints were going pretty deep into the woods. He was pretty concerned that maybe the snow would cover the deer and he would not be able to find it. But what he ended up finding is something that shook him to his very core. There, laid in the snow, was the body of a young woman. It was clear that she had been brutally beaten, killed, and dumped at this location. Despite the fact the woman lay deceased in the falling snow, the body was actually still warm, which is a clear indication of how close we had come to stopping this guy from doing this despicable act. He was charged with murder, and he will never see the light of day again. This happened to me a few nights ago. I was taking my dog for his nightly walk. It was a bit of a windy night, but otherwise it was pretty standard. I've never had any trouble taking these walks, so I was pretty carefree and allowed my dog to walk without a leash. I've lived in this area for a few years, and at least from my experience, I considered it to be low on the number of weirdos, and it contained mostly good people. I was continuing to walk when out of nowhere I heard a voice from a man, and he asked me if I wanted to smoke, and he held out a packet of cigarettes. I was startled. I had no idea someone was even standing there. My dog took an instant disliking to the new stranger. I responded that I was okay, but I also thanked him for his offer. He didn't respond, and there was just an awkward pause, and he walked away. I continued on my walk, thinking nothing of the incident. Just some weirdo in the park, I thought to myself. But what I didn't realize was that this stranger was making his way back to me. And not just casually either. He was running, and he was quickly catching up to me. I awoke. I was very confused and feeling a lot of pain in my knee, but especially my neck. Thankfully, as soon as I was awake, my dog was there to comfort me. The mysterious man was gone. I have no idea what he wanted. He didn't take anything from me. Why was he strangling an innocent stranger in the park? These questions have unfortunately been left unanswered. I reported the incident to the police, but as they do not have much to go on, they were unable to catch the stranger in the park. I now, of course, only walk my dog during the day. A few years back, me and my friends decided to go camping at the local forest. My friends left early afternoon, but I had work, so I told them when I finish work, I would drive up and meet them there. I was about 15 minutes away, and the sun would set soon. Suddenly, I noticed these two men in the middle of the road, and they were flagging me down. Normally, I wouldn't stop, but this was a friendly country town. It was normal to be quite neighbourly. They told me they were driving through a dirt road and managed to get their car bogged and were hoping I would be able to help them out. I was happy to help them and luckily had all the tools I needed to get them out. I pulled the car out rather easily and we said our goodbyes. I didn't think much of it. The men themselves didn't seem suspicious. I just found it a bit odd that they had a four-wheel drive and couldn't get out of that spot themselves. The car should have been able to pull itself out. Nonetheless, the sun set and I arrived at my destination. My friends already had the fire burning, the music cranking and the beers flowing, so I had some catching up to do. I was downing my beers quickly and instantly feeling the buzz. I needed to take a leak. I headed a short distance to do so. When I finished, I went to turn back and return to the campsite, but it wasn't where I thought it was. Nothing but darkness. I think the sculling of the beers hit me quicker than I thought, and maybe I walked further than I realized to relieve myself. I was now lost in the forest. I began trying to find my way back when I saw a light. I headed towards the light and I soon realized that it was a car headlight. I figured whoever it was would be able to help me. The closer I got, I realized I recognized the car. It was the car that I helped get out of a ditch earlier that day. Before I could reach the car, I heard this huge scream. Within about a minute, I saw two masked men jump into the car and speed off. I ran towards the screams and suddenly I was back at my campsite. They all looked horrified, scared out of their minds. I asked them what had happened. They told me two masked men appeared out of nowhere. They didn't say anything at first. They just stared at everyone. It was this real, surreal moment of silence. Then one of the men said, "He's not here." The other man appeared frustrated and then shoved one of my friends to the ground. It's this that made one of my female friends scream, the scream that I'd heard. The men then ran off. It may have been a coincidence, but somehow I think those masked men were looking for me. I've never been so happy to have been lost in my life. It was Halloween 2013. I was 16 years old and was trick-or-treating with my 6-year-old nephew in our local town. We'd covered about 2 blocks door knocking for treats, and we were very successful with the amount of treats that we were able to get. We then reached our next destination. This house had no fences and had a long, curved driveway which led to the front door. We knocked on the door and I stood back so my nephew could take the lead on this visit. It seemed like nobody was going to answer and we were about to give up, and then suddenly the door opened. A woman answered the door. She had dark eyes, dark long hair, and also dressed in dark, daggy clothing. She looked like she had had a hard life. She had not said a word when she opened the door. In her hand she had a wafer tin. She just stuck it out towards my nephew. He took 2 of the wafers. We both said thank you, and the lady just shut the door without saying anything. I couldn't help but feel suspicious about the wafers that the lady had given us, because I had noticed that the chocolate on the inside of the wafer had been scraped out. I decided to tell my nephew that he could not eat the wafer and that we should wait until we get home. But as he always liked being defiant, he wanted to eat it anyway and prove me wrong. So I decided to test the wafer so I knew that it was safe for him to have. What happened after I ate the wafer is a bit hard for me to recall, but I remember smacking the wafer out of my nephew's hand and stomping on it. We decided to walk back to my sister's house because immediately after eating the wafer, I was not feeling like myself. My body felt stiff and was seizing up. Everything around me seemed to be speeding up. On our way back, there is one thing I will never forget. I recall seeing a family. There was a mum, dad, and their son. The son was dressed up as Jigsaw from the movie series Saw, and it's just something I will never forget whilst all this was happening. The boy was just staring at me for a very long time and just would not stop staring. As we started getting closer to the house, I started feeling certain symptoms that I assumed were side effects from eating the wafer. I was starting to feel nauseous, and there was this odd sensation in my chest, which made my heart beat really fast. It felt like there was bubbles in my chest. I also noticed that I was struggling to control my hands. I seemed to be constantly twitching. Eventually, we got back to the house, and my family members were trying to figure out what had happened. One of my relatives thought that the wafer could have contained marijuana, but I felt my symptoms were not consistent with that. We decided the best thing to do was to go to the hospital and find out what had happened. We did a blood test, and it was after this that the doctor had some shocking news. He would go on to tell us that I had methamphetamine in my system. I was completely shocked. What was even more shocking was that the doctor said it was extremely lucky that my nephew did not eat his wafer, as the dose was big enough to kill him. My takeaway from all of this, and my only piece of advice that I will give to you after this story, is never accept unwrapped candy from a stranger at Halloween. Ever. A couple of years ago, I experienced something I hope I never have to go through again. It started off as a normal morning. My partner got up first and was getting ready for work, whilst I was with our newborn, who was a little bit restless. My partner kissed me, left, and shut the door, and that's when things began to get a little bit unsettling. Whilst resting, I could hear what sounded like footsteps coming down the hall towards my room. But that didn't make sense. My partner should have left for work already. Maybe he forgot something. I realized suddenly that I could not move, and this wave of impending fear and dread just came over me. He walked in the room towards the wardrobe and stood there facing me and whispered my name. Anna. He said my name again, but this time in a sing-song voice. There were pauses, waiting to see if I would respond. He sat down on the bed, and I felt a hand on my thigh. I remember feeling scared for my newborn because, although it sounded like my partner, I just had this feeling that it wasn't him. I wanted to turn and see who it was, but I was frozen still. I could open and close my eyes, but that was it. I squeezed my eyes shut to try and go back to sleep so everything would stop and this thing or person would go away. I think I fell asleep. When I woke up, I could move again, but I was very scared, and I was still convinced that there was someone in the house. I knew my phone was flat, but if it wasn't, I would have called the police. Looking back, I think I now know what happened. I believe I experienced sleep paralysis. As bad as that was, it's nowhere near as frightening as the prospect of someone being in the house and imitating my partner. Honestly, I prefer the sleep paralysis story.